I think we are sort of in between stages, right? Like, and I think the last time it was really like this was the jump from patronage to professionalism in the late 18th century, where there was a gap of about 40 years where basically no writer could make a living.
Welcome to The Book I Had to Write. This is the podcast where I talk to authors about their most compelling stories and why these journeys matter to anyone who wants to publish. I'm Paul Zakshevsky. I'm a book coach, podcaster, and essayist. On the subject of writers and failure, there's a lot to say, and today's guest, Stephen Marche, doesn't shy away from any of it. Like the challenge of making a living, always precarious, but never more so than today with the rise of digital publishing. Or the fact that rejection is endemic to the writing life, no matter how famous you are. The Diary of Anne Frank was rejected 15 times, A Wrinkle in Time 26. Even Lolita, perhaps the greatest novel of the 20th century, was turned down by every serious publisher that Nabokov approached. What I find strange is that anyone finds it strange that there's so much rejection, Marche writes. Stephen's new book is called On Writing and Failure, and it's a terrific little meditation and call to arms for writers. He's also the author of a half-dozen books, including The Next Civil War and The Unmade Bed, The Messy Truth About Men and Women in the 21st Century. Stephen was a longtime contributor to Esquire magazine, and his op-eds and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Walrus, and many others. He's based in Toronto, where I talk to him about living with rejection and the state of writing and art making in Canada. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks so much for doing the show.
My pleasure.
And congratulations on the new book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.
There's a funny anecdote that you start with at the top of the book involving you and the short story writer and novelist Nathan Englander, and it's also about Philip Roth. For folks that won't be familiar with your book, can you recount that anecdote here?
Well, I mean, it was sort of, there was a friend of mine who was, she was trying to sell this piece about her death of her mother. It was a really good piece. She just couldn't find a home for it. And, I was trying to help her through, and I was trying to get her, giving her editors' names and so on. And she was like, does it ever get easier? Like, do you get a thicker skin? And I didn't have an answer. So I told her the story, which is that I've been, Nathan Engler moved into my neighborhood just before COVID. And we, to this day, actually, we haven't been in each other's houses, but we would sit around in my backyard, and I got this fire pit, and we would drink and complain. And I asked him, like, did you ever get a thicker skin? Like, and he didn't have an answer. So he told me a story, and he asked Philip Roth this when he was about to release a new novel. He was like, he was having lunch with him or something. And he said, does it ever get easier? Do you ever get a thicker skin? And Philip Roth said, you never get a thicker skin. It just gets thinner and thinner until they can see right through you. So the point of that anecdote is really that, there's never a point where you feel like you've achieved success and that therefore everything is okay and the struggle is over. The struggle never ends, even when you're Philip Roth.
Oof. If it's bad for Philip Roth, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Yeah.
So you talk about a lot of different writerly failures in the book. And one kind that seems to come up is just the issue of earning a living.
Mm-hmm.
But you say something interesting that you kind of came up kind of working inside, I think the phrase you use is crumbling institutions. Can you tell me a bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, the first way that I was going to make a living was as a professor. This is a Shakespeare professor. And I actually got a tenure track job and gave it up because my wife got a job here and we moved back for that. But academia and the humanities are, crumbling. There's like a new Nathan Heller piece in the New Yorker. I've written about it before too. Like it's well known that in that piece it revealed that there are 60 English literature undergraduates at Harvard right now, which is a bit ridiculous, right? That it's that low. Then I moved from there to novels where that is also like sales for novels have been declining for 25, 30 years. And also journalism, where, like the number of journalists' jobs is about a third of what it was in 2005. I only ever tasted really briefly the golden age of magazine journalism. And so, yeah, like these institutions have all been in decline my entire life. And there are things that have been replaced, and there are things that are very interesting and new opportunities that have presented themselves, podcasting and so on. But yeah, like the traditional ways of making a living, they've all been in decline my whole life for sure.
So there's this kind of failure, this potential, this kind of difficulty in just being a writer. And you kind of allude to this in your last answer. There's also just been this kind of incredible digital revolution. I mean, the internet's been around obviously for a few decades now, but things seem to really sped up in terms of like the death of print, or the putative death of print, and certainly the rise of a lot of online publications, although even those are really unstable.
Super unstable. They never last longer than a few years, really.
I mean, what do you find yourself telling other writers, younger writers, who are just struggling with the kind of the realities of the digital publishing now?
Oh, I don't give anyone advice. I mean, like what that like I as I say in the book, like good writers offer advice, great writers offer condolences. I mean, I don't really have any advice for anyone except, you're going to have to roll with the punch. Um, I think we are sort of in between stages, right? Like, and I think the last time it was really like this was the jump from patronage to professionalism in the late 18th century, where there was a gap of about 40 years where basically no writer could make a living. And I think we are in a similar space for that, like a lot of creative industries, really. This transition is incredibly rough. But like the advice I give is like, this is kind of, what this is. Like this is the reality that we're dealing with, and you're going to have to deal with it if you want to actually make stuff. But that's not very useful either, really. I mean, that's not super, like, get used to it is not super helpful advice, I understand.
It's interesting though, because this isn't the first time, as you're suggesting, that writers are challenged this way, and you use this really great example of even someone like Samuel Johnson, who it sounds like was a figure who was this transitional figure from patronage to having to earn money.
Yeah. He was the exact, I mean, he started in patronage and then ended up in professionalism. I mean, the dictionary, his dictionary was that move, right? Where like he was able to make a living off of that dictionary. And he was, yeah, I mean, he was very, to me, he was very much a recognizable figure in that he's out there doing everything. Like he's out there just like the scope of what he's trying to write. Like what he's writing during this period is like he's judging poetry contests, he's translating Latin poetry. He's writing his own occasional verse for the magazines. He's hustling, like he's telling life stories of hookers. He's writing life stories of other writers. He's editing Shakespeare. He's just doing everything of every level that could possibly pay him money. And of course, it's never enough. Right. It was a definite struggle. And I mean, he's also Samuel Johnson. So he's like maniacally, compulsively creating this stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, I think a figure like Samuel Johnson is much more of our age than say of our moment than say even older living writers like Salman Rushdie or something like that. Like there will not be a kid Salman Rushdie anymore. There won't be a kid Margaret Atwood anymore. Like that's just, that world is gone.
So, and you're kind of alluding to this. I mean, one of the forms of failure is just the failure to publish, like the challenge of publishing, and not just today, but you use these kind of classic examples, whether it's James Joyce or Agatha Christie. I think you talk. There are several different examples.
Well, James Joyce is a really interesting example because, obviously the greatest novelist of the 20th century never made a living at it, like never came close to making a living at it. That's not really surprising given the nature of the books that he wrote, but he was also just really incompetent. Like he did not know how to run his life. He just couldn't win for losing. Not that he wasn't a hustler and not that he wasn't smart, because he was. He was just one of those guys. You meet them who it's just never going to work out for them. They can just never make anything stick. And I mean, the story I tell in the story is like he just couldn't get a job at an Italian technical college in Como. It was like applying for this job. They make him write these 3 days of examinations and give a job talk. The job talk he gives is his lecture on Robinson Crusoe, which is literally one of the greatest lectures ever given on a novel. I mean, it's totally extraordinary. Very few people have read it, but it is a wonderful book, wonderful essay. And they were like, "No, your qualifications don't work." So it's like, yeah, you're James Joyce. You've already written Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. You've already written Dubliners. You're in the middle of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and these dudes think you can't speak English. This seems to me very typical. Right. This seems to me, or particularly exemplary of the discrepancy between ability and the marketplace, if you will. The most extreme case, maybe.
It's interesting because when I thought of the word failure, what occurred to me is just what happens very often, what I hear about, especially with emerging writers, which is just things not coming out the way you hope they did. But that's not at all what you're talking about. You're talking about really great writers and that this disconnect between their ability and the great work they're putting out and actually the ability to publish. They're really different things.
Well, I think there's like multiple layers of failure. So there's the career aspect of failure, but I think also in writing there's very much failure is inherent to the process. So most writers, even successful writers, most of their books are failures. I think the other thing to think about is like when you're writing, there's very few processes where you're throwing out more of what you do, right? Where you're making things and then you're like, oh, I hate that, and you're throwing it out. Like you're actually the process of it involves an inherent failure. Like the task of it involves acknowledging your own failures all the time. In fact, that's the biggest part of it, right? Is like going over what was wrong about what you've been saying, right? And how you can say it better and how you can do it better. And refine, like the act of refinement, which to me is the act of writing, is really this process of rejecting failures. And then underneath that, I think you have the sort of deeper failure of writing, which is the most profound aspect of it, which is that when you're trying to communicate between your privacy, your private language, and communicate that to another privacy in another time, in another language, in another place, in another person's private life, in their own person, there's just this a gap. There's this enormous gap between your intentions and what is received. Like this book came out of a bunch of commonplace. Like I used to collect these stories in my mind and in a small notebook because they made me feel better, right? Like they make me feel much better than the stories of writers eventually succeeding. Like those stories are of no use to me, no practical use to me. These stories I found much more useful. But when I started to stitch them together, I'm like, well, there's a reason why all this failure is so endemic to this business. And that is because failure is really inherent to the career stuff, the process of doing it, and the fundamentals of the task you're trying to do. So it's like failure is this kind of centering reality of writing experience.
So, why is it worth persevering then?
That's a question everyone should ask themselves. And I think, another thing is people tend not to persevere for the right reasons, right? Like people persevere in writing for um, a lot of bad reasons. Like, and a lot of great work gets made for money, and a lot of pure crap is made for the best possible reasons, right? Like, I think, it's certainly not that. The argument of the nobility of the soul or something like that. Like that's of very little interest to me. Like I don't think that explains why we write or why we persevere. I mean, I think a huge amount of it is I'm going to show those
Yeah.
bastards. Like that is like a huge impulse behind this. Because one of the more interesting parts of writing the book is when I came across the few people who experienced no resistance, who had nothing to persevere through. The people like this is particularly the post-war American types, like the guy who wrote Joe Gold's Secret for the New Yorker, or Ralph Ellison, where really you are the greatest writer in the world, write whatever you want, and they couldn't write anything, right? They couldn't find a way to say anything. And I think there is, and even when you think about someone like J.K. Rowling, where it's like she, can do whatever she wants. So what does she do? She starts over as like a random bad novelist in Britain, right? Like, because that's the only way that she,
Writing crime fiction.
yeah, right. Like, and that's the only way she can experience some kind of resistance. Although she got sick of that resistance pretty fast when she realized, like, she wasn't going to sell any books. But like, you need the resistance in order to have the impulse to write. I think that's a big thing. As for, like, I mean, I think I write compulsively. I think I write out of, like, some kind, like, the other way people are gamblers or alcoholics. That's kind of the way that I write. I think, I think I would never question other people's motives, because I'm not sure they're relevant.
What inspired this book? You talked a few minutes ago about a notebook that you kept with these kind of little stories of failure. Was that the inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, that was really it. Like, I just sort of kept them for myself, these, like, little anecdotes. The fact that Herman Melville wrote a better book every time, and couldn't, like, every time they sold worse, every time he had to dig deeper into his pocket to pay for more for self publication. The fact that, Billy Budd was in a bread box for like 30 years before it could be published. Um, Stories of, like, Li Bai and Simi Qian and Tu Fu, like, these Chinese writers who really were great geniuses but got nothing. Um, I found them very encouraging, very consoling, and so that was the kind of, um, that was the origin of the book. I mean, then, Dan at Biblioasis said, "Hey, do you want to write this little pamphlet for us?" I said, "I'll write about this," and he said, "Great."
I know that you have a PhD in I think it's early modern drama. You talked about the start of your career as possibly being a Shakespeare scholar. Did that academic background figure in any way in this book?
Well, not really. I mean, there were a few occasional. I mean, I know that Shakespeare had unproduced plays and lost plays, and I mean, it is weird to think of, like, Shakespeare. Like, Shakespeare wrote things that the guys were like, "I don't think so. This one's not for us. Let's not do that." You know what I mean? And, like, I think it's important to know, especially for kid writers, that, it really doesn't stop. Like, I mean, I didn't put it in the book because it's not really about writing, but I mean, one of my favorite stories is about Steven Spielberg, like, trying to sell, I think it was a behind the scenes musical drama or something like that, as a television show, and he just couldn't sell it. He just couldn't find someone to buy this story idea, and I just keep thinking about, like, what were these meetings like? Like, like, it's like, "Oh, hi, my name's Steven. Oh, hi. Yeah, I invented the '80s. Yeah, I've got a new show. I've everything you remember from the 1980s. Yeah, that was me. I got this television show idea." And they're like, we're just not feeling it, Steven. But that's the nature of this game, really. And so, so my academic stuff really didn't figure into that very much, except for, a few examples: Middleton and John Webster, who I knew about their careers, and I knew about Shakespeare's career too. But and I guess they wouldn't be typically well known. But I mean, really, the only thing it gave me is I know how to write a literary history, right? And I know what real literary historiography is, and I know how do you find out what the real stories are and what's nonsense, which, is a pretty important skill when you're uh, dealing with, first of all, anecdotes, but second of all, in the age that we're living in, where there's just this glut of lies,
Misinformation.
and to be able to,
Yeah.
yeah, to be able to figure, that's what I do have from my academic life, is I know how to tell shit from sunshine, really.
And then did the book? I'm just trying to understand the book. Did it change shape, or I mean, it sounds like there's this series that basically these kind of short, like they're longer than pamphlets.
Well, I mean, if the process of writing it was in the middle of COVID, I'd been fired from everything. I had nothing else to do. Like, it was just like, I had no other work. And so I decided, okay, I'm just going to do this as perfectly as I can. Like, I'm just going to write this as perfectly as I can. So I would get these anecdotes, and I would take these notes, and then I would handwrite them with a fountain pen, which I've never done
Wow.
before, on paper, and I would think them through completely, each section, and then write it in a kind of burst, so that it was like each one was like a spoken single thought. And then the other thing that I was determined to do was write a historical, like it is mostly history, as you say, and I didn't want to use the word when ever. Right. Like I was just like, I'm going to write an entire history book without using the word when, because the word when is a really terrible English word. It ruins sentences, and it breaks up thought, and it distances readers. And so that also required a lot of concentration. So that was the basic process of writing it.
This podcast is partly, I think for nonfiction writers who are looking to finish their books. It's one of the
Right.
One of the streams of audience. And I think I know what you're going to say, but if you had one piece of advice for writers who are trying to finish their books, what would that be?
Like, first of all, I don't really, as I said, like good writers offer advice, great writers offer condolences. But I will tell you that one thing that I've told to writers that just really, like when I talk to other writers about like productivity, because I've gone through periods where I've had to be extremely productive, right? Like where I've had multiple projects on the go, writing columns, writing columns to stay alive, writing novels at the same time, or like when I was writing my dissertation and I was writing novels and short stories at the same time. Like I was in massive production mode, and um, like I don't know how useful this is to other people. Let me just give a big caveat, but like there's I actually did research into concentration, because I wanted to get, as I realized that what I needed wasn't really time, it was concentration, right? And when I did that research, that really changed my approach to things, because there were two things that I learned. One thing is the amount of prime concentration time you get in a week is about 5 hours. And the researchers who did that at Harvard said that if you can get 5 hours of concentrated time, like actual pure concentration time, you'll be like Leonardo da Vinci. You can do anything. Like it's not like it sounds like a very short amount of time. But honestly, if you like the important thing is not necessarily get these huge blocks of time where you're working, but to get these like the hour where you're going to do it to be perfect. And so what I do, and this is the thing that no other writer does, but I really believe in, is I sleep the way that bodybuilders eat. Like I sleep, like the question you shouldn't ask is how much sleep do I need? You should ask how much sleep can I get? Because if you really want to be productive, like if we're up to me, if I could do it, I don't have the physical ability to it, but I'd sleep 12 hours a day if I could. But like that's how you, and that sounds like I'm being lazy, but the truth is that if you're writing, like you're not, or you're making like very, because what survives of writing is the best stuff, right? Like that, if you don't do the best stuff, then you just have to go and rewrite it. That really was a writer tip. I've never really given writer tips before.
That was a great writer tip, and it ended really nicely.
But on the other hand, I think it's actually just a sign of my own weird behavior. Do you know what I mean?
Love it.
But like, I'm so convinced of it. Like when I hear about people going into offices to do creative tasks where it's rude to nap, like people in advertising, people who do creative businesses where it's like they're not allowed to nap in these places. I'm like, what are you thinking?
It's terrible.
It's like going to pump iron without being able to eat all day. It doesn't make any sense to me. A.M. Klein, the Jewish Canadian poet who wrote some of the most fascinating material ever produced in this country, suffered a complete breakdown in his early 40s and never wrote again. He barely even spoke. He sat silently on his porch, and the children who had played on his street believed him to be deaf. Scholars demur on the cause of Klein's breakdown. They attribute it partially to overwork and partially to an underlying condition. Later Jewish Canadian writers, Irving Layton, Leonard Cohen, Mordecai Richler, pitied Klein or mocked him. I fear him. I fear him because I know what broke him. The North, the sheer irrelevance of Canadian life, the confrontation with oblivion implicit in living beside the wilderness, the willful indifference to talent that defines Canadian culture. Klein is the ghost that haunts me. There's a little silenced Klein sitting right now in one of the chambers of my heart.
So in this new book, you talk about this Canadian indifference to talent. And
Mm.
I don't know how familiar this will be to listeners outside of Canada, but those in Canada, I think, will recognize what you're talking about. Can you explain that a bit more to me?
Well, I mean, I wrote a big piece about it for the Literary Review of Canada when COVID broke out, where, I said at one point I said like Canada won't love you for what makes you special. It'll love you for what makes you ordinary. And I mean, it is very much a two-edged sword, right? Like on the one hand, it's kind of brutal if you're a talented person. I mean, you just have to go to America, right? Like there's just no choice about it, or somewhere else, or London, or Greece, or or Cuba. You kind of have to go. Um, but on the other hand, like that's why the schools are so good, and why the hospitals are so good, and why it's way easier for talent to emerge from Canada than it is for it to emerge from places like the States or Britain, because there is not everything is samey, and so talent is allowed to rise in a really big way. It just there just is a fear and loathing of excellence that sees it as a threat to equality fundamentally. And I guess in some sense it's not wrong. Like excellence is a threat to equality. Excellence does show that we're not all the same and we don't all deserve the same.
Like, I guess what they call in Australia the tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's like they every country has its own version of this, right?
Right.
Except for America, right? Like and the South has it. In the South they call it the crabs in a bucket, right? Like one crab gets out, they all drag it back, right? Like there's a lot of different countries that have this feeling, although I think in Canada it is particularly extreme.
I was looking through your columns. I saw a decade and a half ago you wrote in the Toronto Star that young Canadian writers have to go to the States. What you just said, you gave
Right.
examples like Jan Martel and Sheila Heti, David Besmogas. You yourself are notable for publishing both in Canada and the States. I mean, do you think things have gotten better or changed? Do you see any difference in the last decade?
Not really. I mean, no, I wouldn't say I've seen any change really, which is kind of extraordinary when you think how much Toronto has changed. But the institutions are in decline, and the cultural institutions in decline that we discussed earlier, which is obviously also happening in America, but it's very definitely happening in Canada. I mean, I feel like the spirit of Canada is managed decline, right? Like that's already a tendency there. And then when you look at
Can you give me a couple examples of that for folks who won't be?
Well, the big one would be the CBC, right? Where you look at how much it's fallen apart, right? And how like and how it's essentially become an administrative pro forma activity with very little interest in either the audience or certainly not in the creativity of its members of its performers, right? Because I mean, I know for a fact that there are hundreds of gifted audio people in the CBC, as gifted as anyone in the United States. You would never know it from what they produce, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and they all know that too, right? I mean, it's not like I'm telling them something they don't know. Like they absolutely know that. And meanwhile, NPR is producing, or Pineapple Studios or Audible are all producing like extraordinary stuff constantly. And Canada just missed out on it. I mean, it's getting a little better now. Like the CBC podcasts are getting they're getting like there are decent shows on there for sure now, which I don't think was true 5 years ago. But it's a bit late to the party.
So in doing research for this new season, I definitely came across a lot of cool new Canadian writing that I didn't
Hmm.
know about. What are you excited about? What are you seeing out there right now in Canadian writing that's kind of catching your attention?
I mean, what I'm really excited about right now is generative AI, artificial intelligence. I've just been commissioned by Pushkin to write an AI generated novel, and that's what I'm going to work on right after we're doing this. And I'm also working with like AI is actually quite a Canadian story. Like the people who invented natural language processing as we know it, a lot of them live in this neighborhood that I'm in. I mean, I met them at the dog park, and we're working on some fascinating stuff. I mean, one thing we're working on is a series where we've trained I'm working with this engineer at Cohere where we've trained this story on prompts and then trained it on a series of models so that every time you click it, it's the same story told in a different way every time. So essentially, it's an infinitely generating textual object. Like it's not really even a story. And then there's all sorts of other experiments that I'm doing with AI that I'm getting really obsessed with it.
Just as it's heating up in the culture. I mean, all you hear about now is not even Chat GPT, but Bing, I guess, and Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on this. I mean, I wrote my first algorithmically derived story for Wired in 2017. I wrote a 17% computer generated story, a horror story for LA Review of Books in, I think it was 2020. And then I did a fully generated one for LitHub in 2021. But I don't think it has actually registered. I think what we're seeing is like people talking about it as a phenomenon, but like this is actually going to be a new medium. And there's going to be incredible artwork made out of it. And we've seen a little bit of it on the visual art side, but mostly crap, really. I don't think it has been. I don't think it has found what it is supposed to be yet. I'm excited. I think it's going to be incredible.
Stephen, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to my interview with author Stephen Marche. I'm Paul Zakrzewski. If you enjoyed the show, then I hope you'll subscribe to it. I'm always grateful for reviews and for sharing the show with friends. To read a full transcript of this and every episode, sign up at thebookihadtowrite.com/subscribe. And if you're working on your own book you have to write, or you want to get started, maybe I can help. I love supporting experienced authors with expert advice and focused coaching. I help writers craft book drafts, agent pitches, book proposals, and more. Find out more about me and my coaching at thebookihadtowrite.com/coaching. That's thebookihadtowrite.com/coaching. And thanks again for listening.